I want to be clear about something before I tell this story. I am not a brave man. I have never been a brave man. 31 years running cargo on the Kithani Passage, and the closest I ever came to heroism was the time I hauled a full load of contaminated grain back to the depot rather than dump it in the transit lane and save myself a week's paperwork. My crew at the time called that integrity. I called it not wanting the fine. There is a difference, and I have always known which side of it I live on. My name is Delvar Knock. I am 63 years old now, and I run a small cargo operation out of Scareth Port with 2 vessels and a staff of 6. The larger ship is the Ardent Proof successor. Technically, the old girl was decommissioned 8 years ago after a structural failure in her starboard bay that would have cost more to fix than she was worth. I stood on the dock at Meridian Station and watched her be stripped for parts, and I felt something that I will not dress up as grief, but was, in fact, very close to it. But that is later. This is about what happened in her, and because of her, and because of a particular cargo run in what was then my 43rd year. I need you to understand the Ardent Proof first. She was a mid-range freighter, twin drive, rated for 32 standard cargo containers in her hold. She had been my ship for 11 years when this happened. She was not pretty. She had a dent along her port bow that I had been meaning to fix since the 2nd year of ownership, and the galley recycler made a sound like a man clearing his throat every time it cycled, and the captain's berth smelled faintly of the industrial solvent the previous owner had used to clean something he probably should have reported to a hazmat authority. I loved her the way you love a tool that has never once failed you at a critical moment, which is a love that is deeper than sentiment. My crew on that particular run was 4. Sen, my first mate, who had been with me 9 years and knew the proof systems better than her own name. Kale, my loader and the largest human being I have ever stood next to, whose intelligence was in inverse proportion to his apparent intimidation. Merritt, the engineer, who was somewhere in her 50s and had opinions about engine calibration that she would share with anyone who stood still long enough. And young Petherick, who was on his first full run and still had the wide-eyed quality of someone who thought hauling cargo between colonial transit points was romantic. He grew out of that. The run was Meridian Station to Portside Scareth, a 6-day transit on the standard Kithani Passage lane. Cargo manifest: industrial filtration components 3 containers, processed textile fiber 11 containers, machine lubricant in sealed drums 4 containers, miscellaneous bonded goods 7 containers and 1 container, hold number 7, listed on the manifest as agricultural equipment, sealed, pre-cleared, and paid for in full by a shipper I had dealt with twice before and had no reason to distrust. His name was Overrath, and he had a legitimate charter, and his clearance codes had passed every check I ran. I did not open container 7 when I loaded it. That was not unusual. Bonded cargo comes pre-sealed. The seals are the shipper's responsibility. I verify the clearance codes, I verify the weight and dimensions, I verify there's nothing on the hazmat or restricted list. Container 7 passed every verification. I loaded it and flew. I found the child on the 3rd day out. The reason I went down to the hold at all was mundane. Merritt had flagged a slight anomaly in the atmospheric processor, a small draw in Sector 3, which was Hold 7's quadrant, that she could not account for from the cargo manifest. It might have been a seal leak. It might have been a faulty sensor. She sent me to look because Kale's hands were too large for the access panel, and Petherick was still learning to read instrument gauges, and she herself was elbow-deep in the secondary drive calibration. I was not busy. I went. The hold was cold and dim, the way it always was in transit. The atmospheric processor keeps it stable but never warm. The containers were stacked in the standard 2-tier arrangement, bolted to the floor rails. Hold 7 was a standard 20-foot container, blue-gray, with Overrath seal tabs still intact on the front latch. The anomalous draw was definitely coming from it. I could hear the processor working harder on that corner than anywhere else in the hold. I stood there for a long moment. A seal leak would show as a pressure differential. I checked the exterior gauge. It read internal pressure at 0.03 above standard, which meant the container was sealed and intact. The draw was not coming out of the container. It was going in. Something in there was consuming atmospheric supply. Overrath had listed it as agricultural equipment. Agricultural equipment does not breathe. I opened the container. I want to be precise about what I found and how I found it, because the way people tell stories about moments like this tends toward the dramatic, and this was not dramatic. It was, initially, simply confusing. The container was mostly packed as described. Crated implements of some kind. I could not immediately identify them in the low light, but they were mechanical, rectangular, the kind of thing that might plausibly go on a farm. They were arranged around a cleared central space, approximately 4 feet square, padded with insulating material. In that cleared space, curled on her side with her knees drawn up, was a small alien child. She was asleep. That was the first thing I registered. She was not dead, not distressed, not conscious. She was asleep, and her chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm that told me whatever the atmospheric draw was, it was keeping her supplied well enough. She had her own small supply unit clipped to the padding beside her, the kind used for personal atmospheric supplementation in low-oxygen environments. It had been running for 3 days. It was nearly depleted. I stood there. I did not move for some time. She was smaller than she would later seem, because small is not a precise enough word for what she was in that moment. She had the proportions of a young child, not an infant but not old either. The limbs that were slightly too long for the body, the outsized quality to the head, the way a child takes up space that is simultaneously too much and not enough. Her skin was pale mint green, the color of old copper just beginning to weather. Her hair was silver white, very fine, spread across the insulating pad around her head. She wore a garment that had once been deliberately made. I could see the quality of the stitching even then, but that was now torn at one knee and the left cuff and stained in ways I did not want to examine too closely. Her ears were pointed, slightly longer than a human's, and even in sleep the way they were angled forward had something to it that I can only describe as listening. I did not know what species she was. I had been running cargo on the Kethani Passage for 11 years, and I knew, by sight, the biological markers of perhaps 14 species. She was not any of them. I took an inventory of the situation as I understood it. I had a stowaway. A child stowaway in a pre-sealed container that had been loaded by a shipper whose clearance codes were legitimate. That shipper had either put her there himself, which made him a trafficker, or someone else had put her there, and the shipper had not checked his own cargo, which made him an idiot. Neither possibility made my situation easier. She was 3 days out from point of origin, with an atmospheric supply that was going to run out in somewhere between 6 and 10 hours, in a hold that was cold but breathable. She was not injured, as far as I could determine without touching her. She was asleep. I thought about waking her. I thought about leaving her and calling it in to Meridian Transit Authority, which is what the regulations say you do when you find a stowaway aboard a commercial vessel. I thought about the atmospheric supply running out in 6 to 10 hours. I thought about the look on the faces of the transit officials who would meet us at Scareth Port if I arrived with a child I had found in a cargo container, and whether that look would be the one that helps or the one that files. Then she woke up. She did not open her eyes and cry out. She did not panic. She came awake the way an animal comes awake, all at once, without the drowsy intermediate stage, going from completely still to completely alert between one breath and the next. Her eyes opened and they were amber, very large, with an iridescent quality that I later learned was a biological feature of her species related to low-light vision. And they fixed on me immediately and without wavering. We looked at each other. She did not make a sound. I have thought about that a great deal since. She was a child, alone, in the hold of a ship she had presumably never seen in the care of an adult who was certainly a stranger, and she did not make a sound. She looked at me with those amber eyes and she was absolutely still, and there was something in that stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of a thing that has learned that sound is dangerous. I crouched down to her level. I did not reach toward her. I simply put myself lower so that I was not a large shape standing over her, and I stayed there. We looked at each other for a while. Then she reached out one hand and touched the back of mine, just the back of my hand, with 3 fingers, very lightly, and then pulled her hand back and watched to see what I would do. I did not move. After a moment she touched my hand again, held it this time. I said very quietly, "All right, come on then." I carried her to the galley. Her name, as I eventually learned it, and it took 3 days of careful listening and a lot of pointing and repetition before I had anything like her name, was something close to Eru. That was not it exactly. Her language used tonal shadings that I cannot reproduce with the human vocal apparatus, and what I called her was a rough approximation, but she responded to it, and Eru she became. The rest of my crew, who I briefed individually over the next 6 hours because I did not want to bring them all to the same moment at the same time, accepted this with varying degrees of shock. Sen said, flat and immediate, "We need to call it in." Kale said nothing for a long time and then asked if she was hungry. Merritt wanted to know what her atmospheric requirements were so she could adjust the scrubber settings in the forward berth. Petherick went visibly pale and said, "Is that legal?" Which was the right question asked by the wrong person, because none of us had the answer and we all already knew we were not going to let the question stop us. We did not call it in. I want to be honest about why. It was not because I had thought through the consequences of what the alternative would mean. It was not because I had looked at Eru and felt some blinding moral clarity about what the right thing was. It was because Kale had asked if she was hungry and Eru, who had been sitting absolutely still at the galley table watching us all with those amber eyes, had looked at the question and very slightly, with exquisite caution, nodded. A nod that seemed to be something she was performing because she had seen humans do it and guessed that it communicated agreement, which was an act of communication so deliberate and so trusting in its way that I could not look at it and also look at the option of calling transit authority and have them feel like the same category of decision. Kale gave her dried fruit from his personal stores. She ate it slowly, examining each piece before she put it in her mouth, and when the bowl was empty, she folded her hands on the table and waited. There was a patience in her that did not fit the size of her body. It was not a child's patience. It was the patience of something that has learned to wait in very small spaces for very long times and had concluded that this was simply what existing required. We had 3 days left on the transit. I am not going to pretend those 3 days were easy, because the truth is that they were not, for several reasons. The first reason was practical. Eru's atmospheric requirements were subtly different from ours, and Merritt spent the better part of a day reconfiguring the scrubbers before she had the blend right. The second reason was medical. I did not know what species Eru was, which meant I did not know what she could eat, what she could not, what a fever would look like on a child with mint green skin and an entirely alien physiology. I had a standard med kit and no alien medicine reference that covered anything that looked like her. We proceeded carefully and by observation. She seemed to thrive on fruit and certain grain-based foods and wanted nothing to do with any protein source we offered her, which Sen hypothesized was an herbivore adaptation of some kind. The third reason was the one we did not discuss aloud, but that sat in the galley with us every meal. We did not know who she was, how she had come to be in that container, or what was waiting for her at the other end of whatever the shipper had intended. On the second day, I spent 4 hours going through everything I could access about Overwrath, the shipper. He was, as his credentials said, a legitimate charter operator. His record was clean. He had 3 vessels, a small but real business, and nothing that came up in any accessible file suggested he had ever been involved in anything that would put a child in a sealed container. I cross-checked his manifests with the cargo handlers at Meridian Station and found that Container 7 had been delivered to the loading dock sealed. Overath had not loaded it himself. His bill of lading showed he had accepted it from a forwarding agent, a name and license number that I ran through the transit registry and found was suspended. Someone had used Overath as an unknowing courier. The container had been placed into a legitimate cargo stream to move it without scrutiny. That was not an amateur operation. That was someone who knew how transit manifests worked and how to hide inside them. I thought about what kind of people put children into cargo containers and move them inside legitimate shipping chains. And I thought about what their interests in recovering that child might be. And I thought, I should be more afraid of this than I am. But Eru had started, by the second day, to explore the ardent proof in small, careful increments, always within sight of at least one of us, touching things with the delicacy of someone cataloging rather than playing. She had found Merritt's small shelf of physical tools in the engine room and stood in front of it for 20 minutes, very still, before Merritt handed her a calibration spanner and showed her what it did. And Eru had turned it over in her hands with an expression I can only describe as professional interest. She had found Cale's private supply of dried pressed leaves, which he chewed for the mild stimulant effect and which he shared with her, and which she found disgusting, and the expression on her face when she spat it out was so vividly, universally the expression of a child who has been handed something terrible that Cale laughed for a long time. She had, by the end of the second day, permitted Petherick to sit next to her at the galley table, which Petherick accepted with the solemnity of a man who understood he had been granted something. She did not speak to us, or rather, she produced sounds that were clearly language, occasional quiet syllables directed at things and at us, but nothing that we could parse. We communicated by gesture and expression and by the slow accumulation of pointed-at objects. By the end of the third day, I knew the word she used for water, and the word she used for the engine sound, and the word she used when she wanted to go to sleep, which she communicated by producing it, and then walking to the door of whatever room she was in and waiting for Sen or Merritt, both of whom she had decided were the appropriate people to escort her to her berth, to follow her. She slept in the forward berth which we had cleared for her. She slept with the door partly open. When I passed it during night watch, I could see the small shape of her in the bunk and the amber glint of her eyes in the dark, watching the doorway. She was never fully asleep, I think. She slept in the way a thing that has learned that full sleep is dangerous sleeps, lightly, in layers, with some part of her always attending. On the morning of the fifth day, I woke up and found her sitting at the galley table across from Sen, and between them was a piece of paper on which Eru had drawn something with the stylus Merritt had given her. It was a ship. It was recognizably the ardent proof, rendered with the slightly too accurate quality of a child who has been carefully observing something she has decided is important. Sen was looking at it with an expression I had not often seen on Sen, who was not a sentimental person. I sat down and looked at the drawing, and Eru looked at me and did not look away, and I thought, whoever is at the other end of this is going to have to go through me. I had not decided that. It was simply there, already decided, the way some things are. We made Portside Scarath on the afternoon of the sixth day. Portside Scarath is a treaty port, which means it exists in the jurisdictional gap between 3 colonial administrations that have never fully agreed on whose laws apply there. It is a useful place to move cargo that does not need too many questions. I had used it as a layover point for most of my career because the docking fees were low and the cargo handlers were experienced, and the authorities that existed were primarily interested in the fees, not in the contents of ships. It was also, not incidentally, a place where I had been doing business long enough to know certain people. I declared the ardent proofs manifest on approach, as required. Container 7 I listed as empty, return to sender, reason, damaged goods. That was a lie, but it was the lie that created the least documentation trail, because empty containers on return journeys are the most thoroughly uninteresting objects in the transit system, and nobody checks them. We docked at slip 14. I told my crew to stay aboard with Eru while I went to the harbor master's office to clear the paperwork. Sen wanted to argue about this. I told her the only thing that would help right now was 4 people who were not visible and 1 person who was handling the official record. She accepted this in the way she accepted most of my decisions, by saying nothing while her expression communicated significant reservations. The harbor master was a woman named Celis who had been clearing my ships into Scarath for 11 years, and who I trusted in the specific and limited way I trusted most people I did business with. She would not lie to me for free, but she would tell me the truth for money, and she had enough professional pride that the information would be accurate. I paid the docking fee. Then I said quietly that I had an unusual situation and wanted to know what unusual situations had been moving through Scarath in the last 6 days. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said that a charter had come through 48 hours ago, 2 men, listed as freight auditors with a Grammath Combine letterhead. She said they had paid for a 48-hour dock hold, which meant they were expecting something to arrive. She said one of them had been making informal inquiries around the transit offices about a particular inbound cargo run, and the run they had described matched my manifest to within tolerances that were not coincidental. I asked what the Grammath Combine was. She said it was a charter extraction firm, licensed under the Colonial Asset Management Framework, a body of legal instruments left over from the early settlement period that had been designed to allow colonial administration to reclaim property and infrastructure abandoned during contested ownership disputes. She said the framework had, over time, been adopted by certain private entities that used the charter licensing system to pursue extraction work that was technically legal under the old instruments, but that most contemporary transit jurisdictions found uncomfortable. She said the Grammath Combine had a reputation for being thorough. I asked what they extracted. She looked at me steadily and said that she had heard various things, and that what she said next she was saying once and then she was going to forget she said it. The framework's original language, as it had been drafted 300 years ago, did not distinguish cleanly between property and persons in the context of disputed colonial assets. She said there were instruments in that framework that had not been formally superseded in certain jurisdictions, and that organizations like the Grammath Combine maintained charter licenses, specifically because those instruments gave them a legal basis in those jurisdictions for writs that contemporary law would not have permitted. I said a writ on a child. She said nothing. She looked at the wall. I said thank you, and I went back to the ardent proof. Sen was waiting for me at the top of the gangway. She already knew from my face. She did not ask what I had found. She said, "What do we do?" I went inside. Eru was at the galley table with Kale and Petherick. Petherick was doing something with his hands, some folding trick with a piece of thin metal sheet, the kind of idle fidgeting I had noticed he did when he was anxious, which was often, and Eru was watching him with the focused patience she brought to anything mechanical. As I came in, Kale looked up. Petherick looked up. Eru looked up at me and then looked at my hands, the way she often did, checking what I was carrying, because what I carried was information about what was happening. I was not carrying anything. She looked at my face instead. She had learned to read my face over 6 days with the attentiveness of someone who has spent a long time learning to read the faces of adults in order to know which way they were going to go. It was not a skill a child should have needed to develop. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she looked down at the table. I sat across from her. I said to the room in general, "We're staying here until I figure something out. Nobody goes ashore." Then I looked at Eru and said directly to her, "You're staying with us." She looked at me. Whatever she read in my face, it was something she held onto. The quality of stillness in her changed, very slightly, just at the edges, like a thing that has been held very tightly for a very long time and is trying to figure out if it is safe to let go even a little. She put her small hand on the table between us, palm down. I put my hand over it. We sat like that for a moment. Then Kale said, "Right then," and started making food, and Petherick went back to his folding trick, and Sen went back to the bridge, and whatever had been decided was decided. The Grammath Combine's men came to the ship the following morning. I had been expecting them sooner. I think they had spent the previous evening trying to verify the manifest irregularity, Container 7 listed as empty, and had needed time to decide how to proceed. They arrived at the gangway at 7 in the morning, which was early enough to be a deliberate statement and not so early as to be a provocation. There were two of them, as Celis had said. They were dressed in the formal attire of corporate charter representatives, clean, dark, well-fitted, and they carried between them a document case and the specific quality of authority that comes from knowing the law is, at least technically, on your side. I met them at the gangway. I did not invite them aboard. The senior of the two was a man named Drav Sount. He introduced himself with the kind of precise courtesy that is a form of dominance, and he produced from the document case a writ of seizure, properly notarized under the Grammath Combine's charter authority, referencing an Ilun juvenile listed under a colonial asset register as unclaimed biological property of disputed ownership status. The writ was real. I had a transit lawyer on call in Meridian, a woman named Adrien who I paid a retainer because my business generated paperwork complications at a rate that made it worth the cost, and I had spent the previous evening transmitting the Combine's identifying information to her and asking her to tell me what I was looking at. She had responded at 3 in the morning with 2 pages of legal analysis that I had read 3 times, and that amounted to: the writ is legally issued, and in this jurisdiction, it is not obviously invalid. Sount explained the situation to me in the same tone of precise courtesy. There was a child aboard my vessel, he said, who had been transported without documentation under circumstances that had raised the Combine's interest. The child was listed in a colonial asset register as property of disputed status, and the Combine had a valid seizure instrument that entitled them to take custody for adjudication. He said that the instrument also provided a liability shield for persons who had transported the child unknowingly, which was to say that if I cooperated, I would face no legal consequences for having carried undocumented cargo. He said that this was, in fact, the better outcome for everyone. He said all of this without raising his voice or using a single word that was not precisely chosen. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "She's not on this ship." He looked at me. His partner looked at me. They had the quality of people who are accustomed to having their writs produce immediate results, and the absence of immediate results was something they were recalibrating for. Sount said that I should understand the Combine had legal authority to board and search a vessel in this jurisdiction if there was reasonable cause to believe a subject of a valid seizure instrument was being withheld. I said that he was welcome to apply to the harbor authority for a search warrant. He said the Combine's charter instruments included boarding authority in cases of seizure-relevant cargo. I said that I was not aware that the Portside Scareth Harbor Authority had ratified the Combine's charter boarding protocols, and that I would be happy to have my attorney check on that while he was welcome to wait at the bottom of the gangway. There was a pause. He said that I was making a mistake. I said that I made a lot of those, and that I was used to living with them. He said the child is Ilun. You understand what that means? I said I didn't. He said the Ilun Colonial Register was one of the clearest surviving examples of an unchallenged asset classification under the old colonial framework. He said the Ilun had been designated as a labor resource in the original settlement contracts, that there were surviving legal instruments, properly filed, that had never been superseded in this jurisdiction, and that under those instruments a documented Ilun minor with no surviving parental registration was, legally speaking, unowned property with a transferable claim. I looked at him for a long moment. He met my look with the expression of a man who finds these facts unfortunate, but is not responsible for them. I said, "Nobody is taking that child." He said, "That is not a legal position." I said, "No, it's not. It's the other kind." There was another pause. His partner's hand moved slightly, not toward anything, just the reflex of a man who has just recalibrated what kind of conversation this was. Sound was more controlled. He looked at me with a professional assessment, and he said that he would return with appropriate authority and that I should consider my position carefully in the interim. I said I'd been considering my position for 11 years, and I found it comfortable. They left. I went back inside. Sen was standing in the corridor just inside the inner hatch, which meant she had heard most of that, which meant Kale had heard it from somewhere behind her, which meant Petherick had heard it from behind him, and the look on all three of their faces was the look of people who have just watched something that cannot be taken back. I said, "I need Adrien on a call. I need whatever I can get on the colonial asset framework in Scareth jurisdiction in the next 4 hours, and I need someone to make sure Eru stays in the forward berth and stays quiet." Sen said, "Delvar, they're going to come back with soldiers." I said I knew that. She said, "Then what?" I said, "Then we need to not be here when they do, but first we need paperwork." Adrien was awake when I called, which meant either she had been expecting this or she had been working on it already, both of which said something about Adrien that I had always appreciated. She had, in the 4 hours since I had transmitted my request, compiled a legal profile of the Grameth Combine's operations in this jurisdiction. She had also, without being asked, pulled the Ilun Colonial Register documentation. She said, "The writ is valid. In Portside Scarath, as in 8 other treaty port jurisdictions, the old colonial asset framework had never been formally superseded because the 3 administrations that shared jurisdiction over Scarath had never agreed on which one of their legal codes took precedence, which meant that in the resulting vacuum, older instruments remained technically active. The Combine knew this. It was why they operated here." She said, "The writ is valid, but it has conditions. A valid seizure instrument under the colonial framework requires physical custody to be transferred within 72 hours of the instrument's formal notification. If custody is not transferred within 72 hours, the instrument lapses and must be refiled, which requires a different notarization process and a 10-day waiting period." I asked, "When was the instrument formally notified?" She said, "It was logged at the Harbor Authority when the Combine's representatives registered their dock hold 48 hours ago." I said, "So we have 24 hours. She said, "You have 23 hours and 40 minutes, and I want to be clear that I am not advising you to use those hours to flee. I am telling you about them purely as a matter of informing you of the legal landscape, and whatever you do with that information is your business entirely, and not the kind of thing I want in writing." I thanked her. She said before I disconnected, "The Ilun, where is she from?" I said I didn't know. She said, "The register lists Ilun as a species designation for a population originating in the outer rim of the Kethani Passage, 3 transit points from Meridian." She said there had been a colonial claim dispute on their home system that had been ongoing for 60 years. She said, quietly, that she had heard the dispute had been resolved recently, in the last 2 years, in favor of the colonial administration that had originally filed the asset register, which was the legal basis the Combine's writ was using. She said that in the wake of that resolution, there had been a number of Ilun who had attempted to relocate through unofficial channels, and that certain parties had found the resulting movement of displaced persons a useful opportunity for the kind of extraction work the Combine did. She said she's not alone. Whatever you do, she is not the only one. I sat with that for a while after the call ended. Then I went to the forward berth. Iru was there. Sen was with her, sitting on the edge of the bunk, and they were engaged in what appeared to be a game of some kind involving Sen's hands making shapes and Iru attempting to replicate them. Iru looked up when I came in. Sen looked at me. I shook my head slightly at Sen, meaning, not now, not in front of her. I sat down on the deck, which put me at Iru's level, and I looked at her and I said, I need you to be ready to move quickly. She did not understand the words, but she looked at me for a long time with those amber eyes, and then she got up from the bunk and went to the corner where Sen had stored the small bag we had assembled for her over the past 6 days. Kale's dried fruit, Merritt's spare stylus, the piece of paper with her drawing of the ardent proof, one of Petherick's folded metal pieces, a small carved wooden figure that I had in my effects and had given her because it was the right size for her hands, and she had stared at it for so long the first time she saw it. She picked up the bag. She looked at me. I said, that's right. She put the strap over her shoulder. I had spent the previous 4 hours not thinking about what I was about to do and also not thinking about anything else. The Grammath Combine would be back. They would bring the harbor authority, or they would bring their own people, or both. The writ was valid, and in 23 hours it would lapse, but before it lapsed they were going to try to execute it. The 23 hours was not a gift. It was a window, and windows close. Portside Scarath had, in my 11 years of using it, given me something more useful than cheap docking fees. It had given me a network. People I had done business with, done favors for, received favors from, in the accumulated unstructured way of any port town, where the same haulers come through enough times that you stop being a stranger. One of those people was a woman named Telvith, who ran a transit coordination office 3 slips down from mine, and whose actual business was approximately 20% transit coordination, and 80% knowing things and knowing people. I went to see Telvith. I told her straight out what I had and what I needed. I did not dress it up. Telvith was not the kind of person who required dressing up and would have trusted me less if I had tried. She was quiet for a while, then she said, Delvar, this is not a small thing. I said, I know. She said, if the Combine comes after you for interfering with a valid writ. I said, I know. She was quiet for another while. Then she said, there's a medical transport, leaves for Meridian in 14 hours. It's running under a humanitarian corridor charter. The administrations don't interfere with the charter in treaty ports because it's the only thing keeping medical supply chains functional, and none of them want to be the one who shut it down. She said, a child with an undocumented health status would be within the corridor's charter to transport. I asked what that cost. She said, a favor, not from you, from me to him. She paused, and from you to me later when I need it. I said, you have it. She said, go prepare your ship. I'll send word when it's arranged. I went back to the ardent proof. The next 14 hours were the longest of my professional life, which is saying something. The Grammath Combine did not return with soldiers in the first 4 hours, which meant they were either going through the harbor authority properly, which would take time, or they were gathering resources. Sen ran the proof's external sensors on passive and reported their 2 representatives making visits to 3 separate offices in the harbor district. Kale and Petherick rotated watch at the gangway. Merritt kept the drives warm on minimum standby, which meant she spent most of those hours crouched in the engine room talking to machinery in a low, private voice, which was what she did when she was afraid and did not want anyone to see it. Iru spent most of those 14 hours in the galley. She had, at some point, found the volume of pressed botanical samples that I kept in my berth, a personal habit left over from a period in my 30s when I had been attempting to learn something about xenobotany for reasons I can no longer fully reconstruct, and she went through it with the deliberate systematic attention she brought to everything mechanical and textual. She could not read the annotations, but she recognized the forms of the plants. Twice she paused and held the book very still and looked at a page for a long time in a way that told me the plant in question was one she knew, one she had seen before, one that belonged to a world she had come from. I did not ask. I sat at the other end of the galley table and I let her have whatever that was. Telvith's message came at the 10th hour, arranged 1400 slip 7. The corridor coordinator's name and the phrase to identify myself. That was all. 4 hours to wait. I have been asked since whether I was afraid during those 4 hours. It is a question that assumes a cleaner internal state than I actually had. What I had was closer to the specific alertness of someone who has committed to a course of action and is now waiting for the variables outside his control to resolve. There is a kind of fear in that. There is also a kind of quiet. The decision is made. The only thing left is the execution. I have found over a long career that the hours of waiting are more clarifying than the hours of deciding, because in the waiting you find out what you actually believe. What I believed in those 4 hours was this: that Eru had been put in a box by people who were trying to save her, and that she had survived 3 days in that box on a depleted atmospheric supply, and had come out of it and touched the back of my hand with 3 fingers and waited to see what I would do, and that whatever I did next had to be worth that waiting. Sen came and found me in my berth at the 12th hour. She sat down on the opposite bunk, which was where she sat when she had something to say that she did not want the rest of the crew to hear. She said, "You know this isn't the end of it, even if we get her to Meridian." I said I knew. She said, "The Combine doesn't stop because one writ lapses. They refile, they come back." I said I knew that too. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "She was drawing in the galley, she drew all of us." She paused. "She drew you biggest." I did not say anything. Sen said, "Delvar, just the name. Then, you're going to need a better lawyer than Adrien for the long fight." I said Adrien was a very good lawyer. Sen said, "She's a very good transit lawyer. This is going to need someone who works welfare and displaced persons law and isn't afraid of a fight that takes years." I said, "Do you know someone?" She said, "I know someone who knows someone. I'll make a call." That was Sen. She had spent 9 years telling me what I was doing wrong and then making the calls that fixed it, and she did not consider this a contradiction. I was grateful for her then in a way I was not always able to say, so I did not say it, and she did not require me to. At 13 hours, Sen reported that the Grameth Combine's representatives had left the Harbor Authority office with what appeared to be a harbor marshal escort. Not many, 2 or 3 uniforms, heading in the direction of our slip. I said, "How far?" She said, 10 minutes. I said, "Merritt, get the drives to half standby. Kale, Petherick, bring everything that's not bolted down into the ship. Sen, close the outer hatch. Nobody fires anything. We're leaving through the front door." I went to get Eru. She was already standing at the galley entrance with her bag over her shoulder. I said, "Time to go." We went out the gangway and across the dock at a pace that was just below running, which is the pace that does not attract the wrong kind of attention at a working port. Eru walked beside me. I kept my hand on her shoulder, not gripping, not pulling, just present. She matched my pace without being directed. She had the bag tight against her body and her eyes were moving, taking in the dock, the ships, the people, the angles. She was reading the space the way she read everything, quickly and with retention. The dock at Scareth in the middle of the afternoon is a working place. Cargo handlers with laden trolleys, ship operators checking their manifests against delivery boards, fuel couriers in their orange vests threading between the larger foot traffic. The noise of it, the machinery, the calls between workers, the deep mechanical thrum of ships on standby, was a cover of a kind. two people moving at purpose among all the other people moving at purpose. I was betting on ordinary. I was also aware of Iru's hand finding the back of my hand as we walked, not holding it, just the three-finger touch, the same contact she had made in the hold when she first woke up, just checking that I was still there. I squeezed her fingers once and kept walking. Behind us, I heard the harbor marshal party arrive at Slip 14. We did not look back. Slip 7 was a medical transport, white-painted, with the corridor's insignia on the hull. A man I did not know but whose face matched the description Telvith had given me was standing at the top of the gangway. He looked at us approaching and looked at me as we reached him, and I said Telvith's phrase and he nodded once. He looked at Iru for a moment, carefully, the way someone looks at a problem they have agreed to take on, and then he stepped back and said, "Berth 4, Medical Bay Corridor. Do not leave the berth until we are in transit." I followed him aboard. Iru followed me. At the door of berth 4, he said, "The corridor charter does not guarantee permanent relocation. It gets you to Meridian. After that." I said, "After that is my problem." He nodded and left. I set Iru's bag on the bunk. She sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at me. I was going to say something useful, something that communicated what was happening, what came next, something that would be the thing a person with experience and steadiness would say to a child in this situation. I did not have the words in her language. I did not have the words in my own. I sat down next to her, and I put my hands flat on my knees, which was a thing she had seen me do before in the galley when I was thinking, and she looked at my hands for a moment, and then she pulled her drawing of the ardent proof out of her bag. She unfolded it and put it on the bunk between us, and we both looked at it. She pointed to the ship in the drawing. Then she pointed at me. I said yes. She pointed to a small figure she had drawn in one of the proof's portholes. I had not noticed the figure before. It was small and approximate, a circle for a head, lines for limbs, two pointed marks for ears. She pointed to it and she looked at me, and she used a word I did not know in her language. I looked at the figure, I looked at her. I did not know what the word meant, but I knew what the gesture meant. I said yes. The medical transport left Portside Scarath at 1400 as Telvith had said. The harbor marshal party arrived at Slip 7 at 1412, which I know because Sen reported it to me from the ardent proof where she was watching on sensors. And 1412 was 11 minutes after the transport had cleared the dock and was in the transit lane, which meant the Grammath Combine's writ expired in the air above a treaty port, and not aboard a ship it could reach. I stayed aboard the medical transport with Iru for the full transit to Meridian. That was my call, and the corridor coordinator had no objection to it. My crew brought the ardent proof in behind us on the standard lane, and Sen handled her, which Sen was fully capable of doing, and which she did without complaint, though she made her opinions about my leadership decisions clear in the message traffic in terms that I will not reproduce. On the transit to Meridian, I spent my time in three ways. I spent some of it working with Adrien, who was already on the problem by the time we were in the lane. Adrien had identified the legal mechanism by which the Grammath Combine's colonial asset instruments could be challenged in the Meridian jurisdiction. Meridian had formally superseded the old colonial framework 14 years ago, which meant the instruments had no standing there, which meant that if we established Iru's presence under Meridian's jurisdiction and got her status registered before the Combine refiled, we would be operating on ground where the writ was simply invalid. That sounds simpler than it was. The Meridian registration process for undocumented persons was thorough and slow, and involved a welfare assessment and a species identification, and a biological record that none of us had, and that was going to require a medical consultation from someone who knew Ilun physiology, which was a specialist category. Adrien had already identified 3 qualified practitioners. She had also, quietly, filed a preliminary welfare registration in my name as the transporting party, which was a procedural step that began the clock on the protection period before the full documentation was complete. The second way I spent my time on that transit was with Merritt, who had come aboard the medical transport because the corridor coordinator did not have an objection, and because Merritt had, at some point in the previous 24 hours, developed a strong professional interest in Iru's well-being that she would not have characterized as personal attachment, and that was unambiguously personal attachment. Merritt worked with the transport's medical officer to do a basic physiological assessment. Nothing invasive, just the kind of observation and measurement that tells you whether a small person is healthy or not. Iru submitted to this with her characteristic patience, which meant she sat very still and watched everything that was done and occasionally pointed at an instrument with a questioning expression that the medical officer addressed each time by explaining what it was for. By the end of the third hour of this Iru and the medical officer were engaged in something that I can only describe as a cross-species medical education exchange, conducted entirely without a shared language, that was deeply impressive and also extremely strange to observe. She was healthy, underweight not alarmingly but noticeably, the kind of underweight that accumulates over months rather than weeks. No injuries, no conditions that the medical officer could identify as acute. She had clearly been well nourished at some point not long ago. She had the physiology of a young child who had experienced a significant disruption to normal life, and was managing that disruption with a competence that exceeded what her size suggested. The third way I spent my time was sitting in berth 4 with Iru in the evenings, after Merritt and the medical officer had finished with her and after dinner. She had begun eating protein cautiously, and was apparently deciding case by case whether she had been wrong about it. We sat and I read, which was my habit, and she went through the botanical book, which had become her habit. And I watched her, in the way you watch something that has become important to you without your having made a decision about it. I had not made a decision about it. I had simply been in a hold at a particular time, and she had been in a container at a particular time, and I had crouched down, and she had touched the back of my hand with 3 fingers, and neither of us had moved away, and somewhere in there the decision had been made, and I had not noticed it happening because it had not been the kind of decision that announces itself. It had been the kind that is simply there, already made, when you look. We arrived at Meridian Station, 11 days after I had loaded Container 7. The process of establishing Iru's legal personhood in the Meridian jurisdiction took 4 months. Adrien handled most of it. There were 3 hearings before a welfare tribunal. There was a protracted challenge from the Grammath Combine, whose refiled instruments I had expected, and whose attorneys were skilled, and whose argument was not frivolous in the jurisdictions where the old framework held. In the Meridian jurisdiction it was frivolous, and the tribunal disposed of it efficiently, but efficiently still meant 3 months of filings. The welfare assessment was thorough. It involved interviews with me, with my crew, with the medical officer from the transport, with an Ilun cultural specialist that Adrien had located in the university district at Meridian. That last interview was the most important. The specialist's name was Rithais, and she was the first person Iru had encountered since her time in that container who spoke her language, and watching them meet was a thing I will carry as long as I can remember anything. Rithais was a small woman, late middle age, with the patient manner of an academic who has spent years working with displaced communities and has learned that patience is not a courtesy but a tool. She came to the waiting room outside the tribunal chamber and she spoke to Iru in Ilun quietly, and what happened next was not dramatic. Iru did not cry. She did not break. She became, instead, slightly less still, the way a held breath becomes a normal breath, not with any visible change but with a perceptible easing of the thing that had been held. She answered Rithais in a low voice, and she kept looking at me across the room while she did it, and Rithais did not tell her to look away. I did not understand a word. I sat in that waiting room and I watched a child find the first voice that could fully hold what she needed to say, and I was glad of it in a way that was also, privately, something close to loss. because it was the first moment in 4 months when she did not need to find me to understand the world, and that was the right thing, and it cost something. Rithais told me after what she had learned. Iru's family name in the Ilun Convention, there is no clean translation. It is more like a kinship group designation, belonged to a line that had been at the center of the Ilun colonial dispute. Her parents had been among those who organized the unofficial relocation. They had not survived the process. She had been placed by surviving community members in the cargo container, with the expectation that it would take her out of the jurisdiction where the Gramath Combine's instruments applied. They had done it the only way they could, with what they had, and the fact that she had ended up on the Ardent Proof instead of where they had intended her to go was either a mistake in the chain or a deliberate rerouting by someone who had been watching for exactly this kind of shipment. Rithais also told me the word Iru had used in the birth of the medical transport, when she pointed at the small figure in the drawing, and then at me. I asked her what it meant. She said, it means approximately the one who holds the door open. In the Ilun language, Rithais explained, there is a distinction between several kinds of guardianship. There is the guardian who possesses, which is the status the Combine's writ had claimed. There is the guardian who tends, which is the word for a formal caretaking relationship. And there is the one who holds the door open, which is the word for a person who makes space for another person to move through safely, a transitional guardian, in the sense of someone who stands between you and the thing that would close the door on you. That was the word Iru had used when she pointed at me. I am 63 years old. I have been a cargo hauler for 31 years. I have no particular virtues and a reasonable number of faults, and I have, over the course of my life, made a small number of decisions that I am satisfied with, and a larger number that I am not, and a still larger number that I cannot clearly evaluate. I am not a brave man, and I have not become one. I did not hold a door open because I was brave. I held it open because she was small and the door was closing and I was there, and the math was simple. Iru, she is 22 years old now. She completed her educational qualifications at the Meridian Institute and then a graduate program in transit law, which surprises exactly no one who knew her at 9 years old reading a manifest with one finger and the focused attention of someone building a case. She practices in Meridian, and she has spent the last 4 years working on the formal supersession of the old colonial asset framework in the remaining treaty port jurisdictions. The 8 ports where the Gramath Combine and operations like it still have active charter licenses under the old instruments. She wins more than she loses. She is meticulous, and she is tireless, and she carries the wooden figure I gave her in a side pocket of her legal case, which I know because she told me. She comes to the port for dinner once a month. She brings documents she wants to talk through, which Sen tolerates because Sen has always tolerated Iru in the way she tolerates things she has decided are permanent. She eats slowly, examining everything before she puts it in her mouth. She speaks 4 languages now, including Human Standard, with a precision and attention that is recognizably the same quality she used when she was pointing at things and waiting for me to tell her what they were called. She calls me Delvar, not father. She has her own word for what I am to her, and it is the one she used in the birth of the medical transport, and it does not translate cleanly, but I know what it means. I made her no promises. I was there and she was there and I did not move away, and that was the sum of it. I kept everyone,